Volume 1, Chapter 1 of Clayhanger by Arnold Bennett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. Clayhanger by Arnold Bennett, Volume 1, Chapter 1. 1. His Vacation. The Last of a Schoolboy. Edwin Clayhanger stood on the steep-sloping, red-bricked canal bridge in the valley between Bursley and its suburb Hillport. In that neighbourhood the Knype and Mersey Canal formed the western boundary of the industrialism of the Five Towns. To the east rose pitheads, chimneys, and kilns, tier after tier, dim in their own mists. To the west, Hillport Fields, grimed but possessing authentic hedgerows and winding paths, mounted broadly up to the sharp ridge on which stood Hillport Church, a landmark. Beyond the ridge, and partly protected by it from the driving smoke of the Five Towns, lay the fine and ancient Tory borough of Oldcastle, from whose historic middle school Edwin Clayhanger was now walking home. The fine and ancient Tory borough provided education for the whole of the Five Towns, but the relentless ignorance of its prejudices had blighted the district. 100 years earlier the canal had only been obtained after a vicious parliamentary fight between industry and the fine and ancient borough, which saw in canals a menace to its importance as a centre of traffic. 50 years earlier the fine and ancient borough had succeeded in forcing the greatest railway line in England to run through unpopulated country 5 miles off, instead of through the Five Towns, because it loathed the mere conception of a railway. And now people are inquiring why the Five Towns, with a railway system special to itself, is characterized by a perhaps excessive provincialism. These interesting details have everything to do with the history of Edwin Clayhanger, as they have everything to do with the history of each of the 200,000 souls in the Five Towns. Oldcastle guessed not the vast influences of its sublime stupidity. It was a breezy Friday in July 1872. The canal, which ran north and south, reflected a blue and white sky. Towards the bridge from the north came a long, narrow canal boat roofed with tarpaulins, and towards the bridge from the south came a similar craft sluggishly creeping. The towing path was a morass of sticky brown mud, for, in the way of rain, that year was breaking the records of a century and a half. 30 yards in front of each boat an unhappy skeleton of a horse floundered its best in the quagmire. The honest endeavour of one of the animals received a frequent tonic from a bare-legged girl of 7, who heartily curled a whip about its crooked, large-jointed legs. The ragged and filthy child danced in the rich mud round the horse's flanks with the simple joy of one who had been rewarded for good behaviour by the unrestricted use of a whip for the first time. 2. Edwin, with his elbows on the stone parapet of the bridge, stared uninterested at the spectacle of the child, the whip, and the skeleton. He was not insensible to the piquancy of the pageant of life, but his mind was preoccupied with grave and heavy matters. He had left school that day, and what his eyes saw as he leaned on the bridge was not a willing beast and a gladdened infant, but the puzzling world and the advance guard of its problems bearing down on him. Slim, gawky, untidy, fair, with his warm black braided clothes, and slung over his shoulders in a bursting satchel the last load of his schoolbooks, and on his bright rough hair a shapeless cap whose lining protruded behind. He had the extraordinary wistful look of innocence and simplicity which marks most boys of 16. It seemed rather a shame, it seemed even tragic, that this naive, simple creature, with his straightforward and friendly eyes so eager to believe appearances, this creature immaculate of worldly experience, must soon be transformed into a man, wary, incredulous, detracting. Older eyes might have wept at the simplicity of those eyes. This picture of Edwin as a wistful innocent would have made Edwin laugh. He'd been 7 years at school, and considered himself a hardened sort of brute, free of illusions, and he sometimes thought that he could judge the world better than most neighbouring mortals. "Hello, the Sunday," he murmured without turning his eyes. Another boy, a little younger and shorter and clothed in a superior untidiness, had somehow got onto the bridge and was leaning his back against the parapet which supported Edwin's elbows. His eyes were franker and simpler even than the eyes of Edwin, and his lips seemed to be permanently parted in a good-humoured smile. His name was Charlie Orgreave, but at school he was invariably called the Sunday. Not Sunday, but the Sunday, and nobody could authoritatively explain how he had come by the nickname. Its origin was lost in the prehistoric ages of his childhood. He and Edwin had been chums for several years. They had not sworn fearful oaths of loyalty. They did not constitute a secret society. They had not even pricked forearms and written certain words in blood, for these rites are only performed at Harrow, and possibly at the Oldcastle High School, which imitates Harrow. Their fellowship meant chiefly that they spent a great deal of time together, instinctively and unconsciously enjoying each other's mere presence, and that in public arguments they always reinforced each other, whatever the degree of intellectual dishonesty thereby necessitated. "I bet you mine gets to the bridge first," said the Sunday. With an ingenious movement of the shoulders he arranged himself so that the parapet should bear the weight of his satchel. Edwin Clayhanger slowly turned round, and perceived that the object which the Sunday had appropriated as his was the other canal-boat advancing from the south. "Horse or boat?" Edwin asked. "Boat's nose, of course," said the Sunday. "Well," said Edwin, having surveyed the unconscious competitors and counting on the aid of the whipping child, "I don't mind laying you 5. "That'd be damned for a tale," protested the Sunday. "We say we never bet less than 10, you know that." "Yes, but—" Edwin hesitatingly drawled. "But what?" "All right, 10, Edwin agreed. "But it's not fair. You've got a rare start on me." "Rats," said the Sunday with finality. In the pronunciation of this word, the difference between his accent and Edwin's came out clear. The Sunday's accent was less local. There was a hint of a short E sound in the A, and a briskness about the consonants that Edwin could never have compassed. The Sunday's accent was as carelessly superior as his clothes. Evidently the Sunday had someone at home who had not learned the art of speech in the Five Towns. 3. He began to outline a scheme in which perpendicular expectoration figured for accurately deciding the winner, and a complicated argument might have ensued about this had it not soon become apparent that Edwin's boat was going to be handsomely beaten, despite the joyous efforts of the little child. The horse that would die but would not give up was only saved from total subsidence at every step by his indomitable, if aged, spirit. Edwin handed over the 10 marbles even before the other boat had arrived at the bridge. "Here," he said, "and you may well have these too," adding 5 more to the 10, all he possessed. They were not the paltry marble of today, plaything of infants, but the majestic rinker, black with white spots, the king of marbles, in an era when whole populations practised the game. Edwin looked at them half regretfully as they lay in the Sunday's hands. They seemed prodigious wealth in those hands, and he felt somewhat as a condemned man might feel who bequeaths his jewels on the scaffold. Then there was a rattle, and a tumour grew out larger on the Sunday's thigh. The winning boat, long preceded by its horse, crawled under the bridge and passed northwards to the sea, laden with crates of earthenware. And then the loser, with the little girl's father and mother and her brothers and sisters and her kitchen, drawing-room and bedroom, and her smoking chimney and her memories and all that was hers, in the stern of it, slid beneath the boys' down-turned faces while the whip cracked away beyond the bridge. They could see, between the whitened tarpaulins, that the deep belly of the craft was filled with clay. "Where does that clay come from?" asked Edwin. For not merely was he honestly struck by a sudden new curiosity, but it was meet for him to behave like a man now, and to ask manly questions. "Runcorn," said the Sunday scornfully. "Can't you see it painted all over the boat?" "Why do they bring clay all the way from Runcorn?" "They don't bring it from Runcorn, they bring it from Cornwall. It comes round by sea. See?" He laughed. "Who told you?" Edwin roughly demanded. "Anybody knows that," said the Sunday grandly. but always maintaining his gay smile. "Seems devilish funny to me," Edwin murmured after reflection, "that they should bring clay all that roundabout way just to make crocks of it here. Why should they choose just this place to make crocks in? I always understood—" "Oh, come on," the Sunday cut him short. "It's blessed well at 1 o'clock and after." 4. They climbed the long bank from the canal up to the manor farm, at which high point their roads diverged, one path leading direct to Bleakridge, where Orgreave lived, and the other zigzagging down through neglected pasturage into Bursley proper. Usually they parted here without a word, taking pride in such Spartan taciturnity, and they would doubtless have done the same this morning also, though it were 50-fold their last walk together as two schoolboys. But an incident intervened. "Hold on!" cried the Sunday. To the south of them, a mile and a half off, breathing mist of the Caldon Bar ironworks, there was a yellow gleam that even the capricious sunlight could not kill, and then 2 rivers of fire sprang from the gleam and ran in 1,000 delicate and lovely hues down the side of a mountain of refuse. They were emptying a few tons of molten slag at the Caldon Bar ironworks. The 2 rivers hung slowly dying in the mists of smoke. They reddened and faded, and you thought they had vanished, and you could see them yet, and then they escaped the baffled eye, unless a cloud aided them for a moment against the sun, and their ephemeral but enchanting beauty had expired for ever. "Now," said Edwin sharply. 1 minute 10 seconds, said the Sunday, who had snatched out his watch, an inestimable contrivance with a centre-second's hand. "By Jove, that was a good un." A moment later, 2 smaller boys, both laden with satchels, appeared over the brow from the canal. "Let's wait a jiff," said the Sunday to Edwin, and as the smaller boys showed no hurry, he bawled out to them across the intervening cinder waste, "Run!" They ran. They were his younger brothers, Johnny and Jimmy. "Take this and hook it," he commanded, passing the strap of his satchel over his head as they came up. In fatalistic silence they obeyed the smiling tyrant. "What are you going to do?" Edwin asked. "I'm coming down your way a bit." "But I thought you said you were peckish." "I shall eat 3 slices of beef instead of my usual brace," said the Sunday carelessly. Edwin was touched, and the Sunday was touched because he knew he had touched Edwin. After all, this was a solemn occasion, but neither would overtly admit that its solemnity had affected him. Hence, first one and then the other began to skim stones with vicious force over the surface of the largest of the 3 ponds that gave interest to the manor farm. When they had thus proved to themselves that the day differed in no manner from any other breaking-up day, they went forward. On their left were 2 pit-heads, whose double wheels revolved rapidly in smooth silence, and the puffing engine-house and all the trucks and gear of a large ironstone mine. On their right was the astonishing farm, with barns and ricks and cornfields complete, seemingly quite unaware of its forlorn oddness in that foul arena of manufacture. In front, on a little hill in the vast valley, was spread out the India-red architecture of Bursley, tall chimneys and rounded ovens, schools, the new Scarlet Market, the grey tower of the old church, the high spire of the evangelical church, the low spire of the church of genuflections, and the crimson chapels and rows of little red houses with amber chimney-pots, and the gold angel of the blackened town hall topping the whole. The sedate reddish-browns and reds of the composition, all netted in flowing scarves of smoke, harmonized exquisitely with the chill blues of the checkered sky. Beauty was achieved, and none saw it. The boys descended without a word through the brick-strewn pastures, where a horse or 2 cropped the short grass. At the railway bridge, which carried a branch mineral line over the path, they exchanged a brief volley of words with the working lads who always played pitch and toss there in the dinner hour, and the Sunday added to the collection of swords and stones lodged on the other ledges of the low iron girders. A strange boy, he had sworn to put 10,000 stones on those ledges before he died, or perish in the attempt. Hence Edwin sometimes called him Old Perish in the Attempt. A little farther on, the open gates of a manufactory disclosed 6 men playing the noble game of rinkers on a smooth patch of ground near the weighing machine. These 6 men were Messrs. Ford, Carter, and Yuval, the 3 partners owning the works, and 3 of their employees. They were celebrated marble players, and the boys stayed to watch them, as, bending with one knee almost touching the earth, they shot the rinkers from their stubby thumbs with a cannon-like force and precision that no boy could ever hope to equal. "By gum," mumbled Edwin involuntarily, when an impossible shot was accomplished. And the bearded shooter, pleased by this tribute from youth, twisted his white apron into a still narrower ring round his waist. Yet Edwin was not thinking about the game. He was thinking about the battle that lay before him, and how he would be weakened in the fight by the fact that in the last school examination Charlie Orgreave, younger than himself by a year, had ousted him from the 2nd place in the school. The report in his pocket said, "Position in class next term, 3rd," whereas he had been 2nd since the beginning of the year. There would of course be no next term for him, but the report remained. A youth who had come to grips with that powerful enemy, his father, cannot afford to be handicapped by even such a trifle as a report entirely irrelevant to the struggle. Suddenly Charlie Orgreave gave a curt nod, and departed in nonchalant good humour, doubtless considering that to accompany his chum any farther would be to be guilty of girlish sentimentality. And Edwin nodded with equal curtness, and made off slowly into the maze of Bursley. The thought in his heart was, "I'm on my own now. I've got to face it now by myself." And he felt that not merely his father, but the leagued universe was against him. End of Volume 1, Chapter 1. Volume 1, Chapter 2 of Clayhanger by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Volume 1, Chapter 2, The Flame. The various agencies which society has placed at the disposal of a parent had been at work on Edwin in one way or another for at least a decade, in order to equip him for just this very day when he should step into the world. The moment must therefore be regarded as dramatic, the first crucial moment of an experiment long and elaborately prepared. Knowledge was admittedly the armour and the weapon of one about to try conclusions with the world, and many people for many years had been engaged in providing Edwin with knowledge. He had received, in fact, a good education, or even, as some said, a thoroughly sound education, assuredly as complete an equipment of knowledge as could be obtained in the county, for the curriculum of the Oldcastle High School was less in accord with common sense than that of the Middle School. He knew, however, nothing of natural history, and in particular of himself, of the mechanism of the body and mind through which his soul had to express and fulfil itself. Not one word of information about either physiology or psychology had ever been breathed to him, nor had it ever occurred to anyone around him that such information was needful. And as no one had tried to explain to him the mysteries which he carried about with him inside that fair skin of his, so no one had tried to explain to him the mysteries by which he was hemmed in, either mystically through religion, or rationally through philosophy. Never in chapel or at Sunday school had a difficulty been genuinely faced. And as for philosophy, he had not the slightest conception of what it meant. He imagined that a philosopher was one who made the best of a bad job, and he had never heard the word used in any other sense. He had great potential intellectual curiosity, but nobody had thought to stimulate it by even casually telling him that the finest minds of humanity had been trying to systematize the mysteries for quite 25 centuries. Of physical science he had been taught nothing, save a grotesque proportion to the effect that gravity was a force which drew things towards the centre of the earth. In the matter of chemistry, it had been practically demonstrated to him scores of times, so that you should never forget this grand basic truth, that sodium and potassium may be relied upon to fizz flamingly about on a surface of water. Of geology he was perfectly ignorant, though he lived in a district whose whole livelihood depended on the scientific use of geological knowledge, and though the existence of Oldcastle itself was due to a freak of the earth's crust, which geologists call a fault. 2. Geography had been one of his strong points. He was aware of the rivers of Asia in their order, and of the principal products of Uruguay, and he could name the capitals of nearly all the United States. But he had never been instructed for 5 minutes in the geography of his native county, of which he knew neither the boundaries, nor the rivers, nor the terrene characteristics. He could have drawn a map of the Orinoco, but he could not have found the Trent in a day's march. He did not even know where his drinking water came from. That geographical considerations are the cause of all history had never been hinted to him, nor that history bears immediately upon modern life and bore on his own life. For him, history hung unsupported and unsupporting in the air. In the course of his school career, he had several times approached the 19th century, but it seemed to him that for administrative reasons he was always being dragged back again to the Middle Ages. Once his form had got as far as the infancy of his own father, and concerning this period he had learnt that great dissatisfaction prevailed among the labouring classes, who were led to believe by mischievous demagogues, etc. But the next term he was recoiling round Henry VIII, who was a skilful warrior and politician, but unfortunate in his domestic relations, and so to Elizabeth, than whom few sovereigns have been so much belied, but her character comes out unscathed after the closest examination. History indeed resolved itself into a series of more or less sanguinary events, arbitrarily grouped under the names of persons who had to be identified with the assistance of numbers. Neither of the development of national life, nor of the clash of nations, did he really know anything that was not inessential and anecdotic. He could not remember the clauses of Magna Carta, but he knew eternally that it was signed at a place amusingly called Runnymede, and the one fact engraved on his memory about the Battle of Waterloo, that it was fought on a Sunday. And as he had acquired absolutely nothing about political economy or about logic, and was therefore at the mercy of the first agreeable sophistry that might take his fancy by storm, his unfitness to commence the business of being a citizen almost reached perfection. 3. For his personal enjoyment of the earth and air and sun and stars, and of society and solitude, no preparation had been made or dreamt of. The sentiment of nature had never been encouraged in him, or even mentioned. He knew not how to look at a landscape, nor at a sky. Of plants and trees he was as exquisitely ignorant as of astronomy. It had not occurred to him to wonder why the days are longer in summer, and he vaguely supposed that the cold of winter was due to an increased distance of the earth from the sun. Still, he had learnt that Saturn had a ring, and sometimes he unconsciously looked for it in the firmament, as for a tea-tray. Of art and the arts he had been taught nothing. He had never seen a great picture or statue, nor heard great orchestral or solo music, and he had no idea that architecture was an art and emotional, though it moved him in a very peculiar fashion. Of the art of English literature, or of any other literature, he had likewise been taught nothing. But he knew the meaning of a few obsolete words in a few plays of Shakespeare. He had not learnt how to express himself orally in any language, but through hard drilling he was so genuinely erudite in accidence and syntax that he could parse and analyze with superb assurance the most magnificent sentences of Milton, Virgil, and Racine. This skill, together with an equal skill in utilizing the elementary properties of numbers and geometrical figures, was the most brilliant achievement of his long apprenticeship. And now his education was finished. It had cost his father 28 shillings a term, or 4 guineas a year, and no trouble. In younger days his father had spent more money and far more personal attention on the upbringing of a dog. His father had enjoyed success with dogs through treating them as individuals, but it had not happened to him, nor to anybody in authority, to treat Edwin as an individual. Nevertheless, it must not be assumed that Edwin's father was a callous and conscienceless brute, and Edwin a martyr of neglect. Old Clayhanger was, on the contrary, an average, upright, and respectable parent who had given his son a thoroughly sound education, and Edwin had had the good fortune to receive that thoroughly sound education as a preliminary to entering the world. 4. He was very far from realizing the imperfections of his equipment for the grand entry, but still he was not without uneasiness. In particular, the conversation incident to the canal boat wager was disturbing him. It amazed him, as he reflected, that he should have remained, to such an advanced age, in a state of ignorance concerning the origin of the clay from which the crocks of his native district were manufactured. That the Sunday should have been able to inform him did not cause him any shame, for he guessed from the peculiar eager tone of voice in which the facts had been delivered that the Sunday was merely retailing some knowledge recently acquired by chance. He knew all the Sunday's tones of voice, and he also was well aware that the Sunday's brain was not on the whole better stored than his own. Further, the Sunday was satisfied with his bit of accidental knowledge. Edwin was not. Edwin wanted to know why, if the clay for making earthenware was not got in the Five Towns, the Five Towns had become the great seat of the manufacture. Why were not pots made in the south, where the clay came from? He could not think of any answer to this enigma, nor of any means of arriving by himself at an answer. The feeling was that he ought to have been able to arrive at the answer, as at the answer to an equation. He did not definitely blame his education. He did not think clearly about the thing at all. But, as a woman with a vague discomfort dimly fears cancer, so he dimly feared that there might be something fundamentally unsound in this sound education of his, and he had remorse for all the shirking that he had been guilty of during all his years at school. He shook his head solemnly at the immense and nearly universal shirking that continually went on. He could only acquit 3 or 4 boys among the hundreds he had known of the shameful sin, and all that he could say in favour of himself was that there were many worse than Edwin Clayhanger. Not many of the boys, but the masters, were sinners. Only 2 masters could he unreservedly respect as having acted conscientiously up to their pretensions, and one of these was an unpleasant brute. All the cleverness, the ingenuities, the fakes, the insincerities, the impecacities, the vanities, and the dishonesties of the rest stood revealed to him, and he judged them by the mere essential force of character alone. A schoolmaster might as well attempt to deceive God as a boy who is watching him every day with the inhuman eye of youth. All this must end now, he said to himself, meaning all that could be included in the word shirk. 5. He was splendidly serious. He was as splendidly serious as a reformer. By a single urgent act of thought he would have made himself a man and changed imperfection into perfection. He desired, and there was real passion in his desire, to do his best, to exhaust himself in doing his best, in living according to his conscience. He did not know of what he was capable, nor what he could achieve. Achievement was not the matter of his desire, but endeavour, honest and terrific endeavour. He admitted to himself his shortcomings, and he did not underestimate the difficulties that lay before him. But he said, thinking of his father, "Surely he'll see I mean business. Surely he's bound to give in when he sees how much in earnest I am." He was convinced, almost, that passionate faith could move mountainous fathers. "I'll show 'em," he muttered. And he meant that he would show the world. He was honouring the world. He was paying the finest homage to it. In that head of his a flame burnt that was like an altar fire, a miraculous and beautiful phenomenon, than which nothing is more miraculous nor more beautiful over the whole earth. Whence had it suddenly sprung, that flame? After years of muddy inefficiency, of contentedness with the second-rate and the dishonest, that flame astoundingly bursts forth from a hidden, unheeded spark that none had ever thought to blow upon. It bursts forth out of a damp jungle of careless habits and negligence that could not possibly have fed it. There is little to encourage it. The very architecture of the streets shows that environment has done naught for it. ragged brickwork, walls finished anyhow with saggars and slag, narrow, uneven alleys leading to higgledy-piggledy workshops and kilns, cottages transformed into factories, and factories into cottages, clumsily, hastily, because nothing matters so long as it will do. Everywhere something forced to fulfil, badly, the function of something else. In brief, the reign of the slovenly makeshift, shameless, filthy, and picturesque. Edwin himself seemed no tabernacle for that singular flame. He was not merely untidy and dirty. At his age such defects might have excited in a sane observer uneasiness by their absence. But his gestures and his gait were untidy. He did not mind how he walked. All his sprawling limbs were saying, "What does it matter so long as we get there?" The angle of the slatternly bag across his shoulders was an insult to the flame. And yet the flame burned with serene and terrible pureness. It was surprising that no one saw it passing along the mean, black, smoke-palled streets that huddle about St. Luke's Church. Sundry experienced and fat old women were standing or sitting at their cottage doors, one or two smoking gutties. But even they, who in childbed and at gravesides had been at the very core of life for long years, they who saw more than most, could only see a fresh lad passing along, with fair hair and a clear complexion and gawky knees and elbows, a fierce, rapt expression on his straightforward, good-natured face. Some knew that it was Clayhanger's lad, a nice-behaved young gentleman, and the spitten image of his poor mother. They all knew what a lad is, the feel of his young skin under his duds, the capricious freedom of his movements, his sudden madnesses and shoutings and tendernesses, and the exceeding power of his unconscious wilful charm. They could divine all that in a glance, but they could not see the mysterious and holy flame of the desire for self-perfection blazing within that tousled head. And if Edwin had suspected that anybody could indeed perceive it, he would have whipped it out for shame, though the repudiation had meant everlasting death. Such is youth in the Five Towns, if not elsewhere. End of Volume 1, Chapter 2. Volume 1, Chapter 3 of Clayhanger by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Volume 1, Chapter 3, Entry into the World. Edwin came steeply out of the cinder-strewn back streets by Woodison Bank into Duck Square, nearly at the junction of Trafalgar Road and Wedgwood Street. A few yards down Woodison Bank, cocks and hens were scurrying with necks horizontal from all quarters, and were even flying, to the call of a little old woman who threw grain from the top step of her porch. On the level of the narrow pavement stood an immense constable, clad in white trousers, with a gun under his arm for the killing of mad dogs. He was talking to the woman, and their two heads were exactly at the same height. On a pair of small double gates near the old woman's cottage were painted the words, "Steam Printing Works, no admittance except on business." And from as far as Duck Square could be heard the puff, puff, which proved the use of steam in this works, to which idlers and mere pleasure-seekers were forbidden access. Duck Square was one of the oldest, if the least imposing, of all the public places in Bursley. It had no traffic across it, being only a sloping rectangle, like a vacant lot, with Trafalgar Road and Wedgwood Street for its exterior sides, and no outlet on its inner sides. The buildings on those inner sides were low and humble, and, as it were, withdrawn from the world, the chief of them being the ancient Duck Inn, where the hand-bell-ringers used to meet. But Duck Square looked out upon the very birth of Trafalgar Road, that wide, straight thoroughfare whose name dates it, which had been invented in the lifetime of a few then living, to unite Bursley with Hambridge. It also looked out upon the birth of several old pack-horse roads which Trafalgar Road had supplanted. One of these was Woodison Bank, that wound slowly uphill and down dale, apparently always choosing the longest and hardest route to Hambridge, and another was Aboukir Street, formerly known as Warm Lane, that reached Hanbridge in a manner equally difficult and unharried. At the junction of Trafalgar Road and Aboukir Street stood the Dragon Hotel, once the great posting-house of the town, from which all roads started. Duck Square had watched coaches and wagons stop at and start from the Dragon Hotel for hundreds of years. It had seen the Dragon rebuilt in brick and stone, with fine bay windows on each story, in early Georgian times, and it had seen even the new structure become old and assume the dignity of age. Duck Square could remember strings of pack-mules driven by women, trapezing in zigzags down Woodison Bank and Warm Lane, and occasionally falling, with awful smashes of the crockery they carried, in the deep, slippery, scarce passable mire of the first slants into the valley. Duck Square had witnessed the slow declension of these roads into mere streets, and slum streets at that, and the death of all mules, and the disappearance of all coaches, and all neighing and prancing and whip-cracking romance, while Trafalgar Road, simply because it was straight and broad and easily graded, flourished with toll-bars and a couple of pair-horsed trams that ran on lines. And many people were proud of those cushioned trams, but perhaps they had never known that coach-drivers used to tell each other about the state of the turn at the bottom of Warm Lane, since absurdly renamed in honour of an Egyptian battle, and that Woodison Bank, now unnoticed save by doubtful characters, policemen, and schoolboys, was once regularly taken by 4 horses at a canter. The history of human manners is crunched and embedded in the very macadam of that part of the borough, and the burgesses unheedingly tread it down every day, and talk gloomily about the ugly, smoky prose of industrial manufacture. And yet the Dragon Hotel, safely surviving all revolutions by the mighty virtue and attraction of ale, stands before them to remind them of the interestingness of existence. 2. At the southern corner of Trafalgar Road and Wedgwood Street, with Duck Square facing it, the Dragon Hotel and Warm Lane to its right, and Woodison Bank creeping inconspicuously down to its left, stood a 3-story building consisting of house and shop, the frontage being in Wedgwood Street. Over the double-windowed shop was a discreet signboard in gilt letters, D. Clayhanger, Printer and Stationer. But above the first floor was a later and much larger sign with the single word, Steam Printing. All the brickwork of the facade was painted yellow, and had obviously been painted yellow many times. The woodwork of the plate-glass windows was a very dark green, approaching black. The upper windows were stumpy, almost square, some dirty, and some clean and curtained, with prominent sills and architraves. The line of the projecting spouting at the base of the roof was slightly curved through subsidence. At either end of the roof ridge rose twin chimneys, each with 3 salmon-coloured chimney-pots. The gigantic word Steam Printing could be seen from the windows of the Dragon, from the porch of the big Wesleyan chapel higher up the slope, from the Conservative Club and the playground at the top of the slope, and as for Duck Square itself, it could see little else. The left-hand shop window was alluringly set out with the lighter apparatus of writing and reading, and showed incidentally several rosy pictures of ideal English maidens. That to the right was grim and heavy, with ledgers, inks, and variegated specimens of steam printing. 3. In the wedge-shaped doorway between the windows stood 2 men, one middle-aged and one old, one bareheaded and the other with a beaver hat, engaged in conversation. They were talking easily, pleasantly, with free gestures, the younger looking down in deferential smiles at the elder, and the elder looking up benignantly at the younger. You could see that, having begun with a business matter, they had quitted it for a topic of the hour. But business none the less went forward. The shop functioned, the presses behind the shop were being driven by steam, as advertised. A customer emerged, and was curtly nodded at by the proprietor as he squeezed past. A girl with a small flannel apron over a large cotton apron went timidly into the shop. The trickling, calm commerce of a provincial town was proceeding, bit being added to bit and item to item, until at the week's end a series of apparent nothings had swollen into the livelihood of near 60 of people. And nobody perceived how interesting it was, this interchange of activities, this ebb and flow of money, this sluggish rise and fall of reputations and fortunes, stretching out of one century into another, and towards a third. Printing had been done at that corner, though not by steam, since the time of the French Revolution. Bibles and illustrated herbals had been laboriously produced by hand at that counter, and hawked on the backs of asses all over the county, and nobody heard romance in the puffing of the hidden steam-engine, multiplying catalogues and bill-heads on the self-same spot at the rate of hundreds an hour. The younger and bigger of the two men chatting in the doorway was Darius Clayhanger, Edwin's father, and the first printer to introduce steam into Bursley. His age was then under 45, but he looked more. He was dressed in black, with an ample shirt-front and a narrow black cravat tied in an angular bow. The wristbands were almost tight on the wrists, and, owing to the shortness of the alpaca coat-sleeves, they were very visible even as Darius Clayhanger stood, with his two hands deep in the horizontal pockets of his full-fall trousers. They were not precisely dirty, these wristbands, nor was the shirt-front, nor the turned-down pointed collar, but all the linen looked as though it would scarcely be wearable the next day. Clayhanger's linen invariably looked like that, not dirty and not clean. And further, he appeared to wear eternally the same suit, ever on the point of being done for, and never being done for. The trousers always had marked transverse creases. The waistcoat always showed shiningly the outline of every article in the pockets thereof, and it always had a few stains down the front, and never more than a few, and the lowest button insecure. The coat, faintly discoloured round the collar and fretted at the cuffs, fitted him easily and loosely, like the character of an old crony. It was as if it had grown up with him, and had expanded with his girth. His head was a little bald on top, but there was still a great deal of mixed brown and greyish hair at the back and the sides, and the moustache, hanging straight down, with an effect recalling the mouth of a seal, was plenteous and defiant, a moustache of character, contradicting the full placidity of the badly shaved chin. Darius Clayhanger had a habit, when reflected or fierce, of biting with his upper teeth as far down as he could on the lower lip. This trick added emphasis to the moustache. He stood, his feet in their clumsy boots planted firmly about 16 inches apart, his elbows sticking out, and his head bent sideways, listening to and answering his companion with mien now eager, now roguish, now distinctly respectful. The older man, Mr. Shushens, was apparently very old. He was one of those men of whom one says in conclusion that they are very old. He seemed to be so fully occupied all the time in conducting those physical operations which we perform without thinking of them, that each, in his case, became a feat. He balanced himself on his legs with conscious craft. He directed carefully his shaking and gnarled hand to his beard in order to stroke it. When he collected his thoughts into a sentence and uttered it in his weak, quavering voice, he did something wonderful. He listened closely, as though to an imperfectly acquired foreign language, and when he was not otherwise employed, he gave attention to the serious business of breathing. He wore a black silk stock, in a style even more antique than his remarkable headgear, and his trousers were very tight. He had survived into another and a more fortunate age than his own. 4. Edwin, his heavy bag on his shoulders, found the doorway blocked by these two. He hesitated with a diffident, charming smile, feeling, as he often did in front of his father, that he ought to apologize for his existence, and yet fiercely calling himself an ass for such a sentiment. Darius Clayhanger nodded at him carelessly, but not without a surprising benevolence, over his shoulder. "This is him," said Darius briefly. Edwin was startled to catch a note of pride in his father's voice. Little Mr. Shushens turned slowly and looked up at Edwin's face, for he was shorter even than the boy, and gradually acquainted himself with the fact that Edwin was the son of his father. "Is this thy son, Darius?" he asked, and his ancient eyes were shining. Edwin had scarcely ever heard anyone address his father by his Christian name. Darius nodded, and then, seeing the old man's hand creeping out towards him, Edwin pulled off his cap and took the hand, and was struck by the hot, smooth brittleness of the skin and the earnest, tremulous weakness of the caressing grasp. Edwin had never seen Mr. Shushens before. "Nay, nay, me boy," trembled the old man. "Don't bear thy head to me, not to me. I'm of the old sort. I'm rare glad to see thee." He kept Edwin's hand, and stared long at him, with his withered face transfigured by solemn emotion. Slowly he turned towards Darius, and pulled himself together. "Thou'st begotten a fine lad, Darius, a fine honest lad." "So," said Darius gruffly, whom Edwin was amazed to see in a state of agitation similar to that of Mr. Shushan's. The men gazed at each other. Edwin looked at the ground and other unresponsive objects. "Edwin," his father said abruptly, "run and ask Big James for the proof of that primitive Methodist hymn paper. There's a good lad." And Edwin hastened through the shadowy shop as if loosed from a captivity, and in passing threw his satchel down on the bale of goods. 5. He comprehended nothing of the encounter, neither as to the origin of the old man's status in his father's esteem, nor as to the cause of his father's strange emotion. He regarded the old man impatiently as an aged simpleton, probably over-pious, certainly connected with the primitive Methodists. His father had said, "There's a good lad," almost cajolingly. And this was odd, for though nobody could be more persuasively agreeable than his father when he chose, the occasions when he cared to exert his charm, especially over his children, were infrequent and getting more so. Edwin also saw something symbolically ominous in his being sent direct to the printing office. It was no affair of his to go to the printing office. He particularly did not want to go to the printing office. However, he met Big James, with flowing beard and flowing apron, crossing the yard. Big James was brushing crumbs from the beard. "Father wants the proof of some hymn paper, I don't know what," he said. "I was just coming." "So was I, Mr. Edwin," replied Big James in his magnificent voice, and with his curious humorous smile. And he held up a sheet of paper in his immense hand, and strode majestically on towards the shop. Here was another detail that struck the boy. Always Big James had addressed him as Master Edwin or Master Clayhanger. Now it was Mr. He had left school. Big James was of course aware of that, and Big James had enough finesse and enough gentle malice to change instantly the master to Mr. Edwin was scarcely sure if Big James was not laughing at him. He could not help thinking that Big James had begun so promptly to call him Mr. because the foreman compositor expected that the son of the house would at once begin to take a share in the business. He could not help thinking that his father must have so informed Big James. And all this vaguely disturbed Edwin, and reminded him of his impending battle and of the complex forces marshalled against him. And his hand, wandering in his pockets, touched that unfortunate report which stated that he had lost one place during the term. 6. He lingered in the blue-paved yard, across which cloud shadows swept continually, and then Big James came back and spectacularly ascended the flight of wooden steps to the printing office, and disappeared. Edwin knew that he must return to the shop to remove his bag, for his father would assuredly reprimand him if he found it where it had been untidily left. He sidled, just like an animal, to the doorway, and then slipped up to the counter, behind the great mahogany case of artists' materials. His father and the old man were within the shop now, and Edwin overheard that they were discussing a topic that had lately been rife in religious circles, namely, Sir Henry Thompson's ingenious device for scientifically testing the efficacy of prayer, known as the prayer gauge. The scheme was to take certain hospitals and to pray for the patients in particular wards, leaving other wards unprayed for, and then to tabulate and issue the results. Mr. Shushan's profoundly resented the employment of such a dodge. The mere idea of it shocked him as being blasphemous, and Darius Clayhanger deferentially and feelingly agreed with him, though Owen had at least once heard his father refer to the topic with the amused and non-committal impartiality of a man who only went to chapel when he specially felt like going. "I've preached in the pulpits of the Connection," said Mr. Shushan with solemn, quavering emotion, "for over 50 years, you know. but I ne'er gie out another text if primitives and aught to do with such a flouting of the Almighty. Nay, I go down to my grave dumb afore God." He had already been upset by news of a movement that was on foot for deferring anniversary sermons from August to September, so that people should be more free to go away for a holiday and collections be more fruitful. What? Put off God's ordinance to enable chapel members to go a-waxing? Monstrous! Yet September was tried, in spite of Mr. Shushan's, and when even September would not work satisfactorily, God's ordinance was shifted boldly to May, in order to catch people and their pockets well before the demoralization incident to holidays. Edwin thought that his father and the mysterious old man would talk for ever, and timorously he exposed himself to obtain possession of his satchel, hoping to escape unseen. But Mr. Shushan saw him, and called him, and took his hand again. "Eh, my boy," he said, feebly shaking the hand, "I do pray as you'll grow up to be worthy of your father. That's all as I pray for." Edwin had never considered his father as an exemplar. He was a just and merciful judge of his father, against whom he had 1,000 grievances. And in his heart he resentfully despised Mr. Shushan's, and decided again that he was a simpleton, and not a very tactful one. But then he saw a round yellow tear slowly form in the red rim of the old man's eye, and run crookedly down that wrinkled cheek, and his impatient scorn expired. The mere sight of him, Edwin, had brought the old man to weeping, and the tear was so genuine, so convincing, so majestic, that it induced in Edwin a blank humility. He was astounded, mystified, but he was also humbled. He himself was never told, and he had never learnt, the explanation of that epic tear. End of Volume 1, Chapter 3. Volume 1, Chapter 4 of Clayhanger by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Volume 1, Chapter 4, The Child Man. The origin of the tear on the aged cheek of Mr. Shushan's went back about 40 years, and was embedded in the infancy of Darius Clayhanger. The earliest memory of Darius Clayhanger had to do with the capital letters Q, W, and S. Even as the first steam printer in Bursley, even as the father of a son who had received a thoroughly sound middle-class education, he never noticed a capital Q, W, or S without recalling the Widow Susan's at school, where he had wonderingly learnt the significance of those complicated characters. The school consisted of the entire ground floor of her cottage, namely, one room, of which the far corner was occupied by a tiny winding staircase that led to the ancient widow's bedchamber. The furniture comprised a few low forms for scholars, a table, and a chair, and there were some brilliant coloured prints on the whitewashed walls. At this school Darius acquired a knowledge of the alphabet, and from the alphabet passed to reading made easy, and then to the Bible. He made such progress that the widow soon singled him out for honour. He was allowed the high and envied privilege of raking the ashes from under the fireplace and carrying them to the ash-pit, which ash-pit was vast and lofty, being the joint production of many cottages. To reach the summit of the ash-pit, and thence to fling backwards down its steep sides all assailants who challenged your supremacy, was a precious joy. The battles of the ash-pit, however, were not battles of giants, as no children had leisure for ash-carrying after the age of 7. A still greater honour accorded to Darius was permission to sit, during lessons, on the topmost visible step of the winding stair. The widow Susan, having taught Darius to read brilliantly, taught him to knit, and he would knit stockings for his father, mother, and sister. At the age of 7, his education being complete, he was summoned into the world. It is true that he could neither write nor deal with the multiplication table, but there were always night schools which studious adults of 7 and upwards might attend if business permitted. Further, there was the Sunday school, which Darius had joyously frequented since the age of 3, and which he had no intention of leaving. As he grew older, the Sunday school became more and more enchanting to him. Sunday morning was the morning which he lived for during 6 days. It was the morning when his hair was brushed and combed and perfumed with a delightful oil, whose particular fragrance he remembered throughout his life. At Sunday school he was petted and caressed. His success at Sunday school was shining. He passed over the heads of bigger boys, and at the age of 6 he was in a Bible class. Upon hearing that Darius was going out into the world, the superintendent of the Sunday school, a grave, whiskered young man of perhaps 30, led him one morning out of the body of the primitive Methodist chapel, which served as schoolroom before and after chapel service, up into the deserted gallery of the chapel, and there seated him on a stair, and knelt on the stair below him, and caressed his head, and called him a good boy, and presented him with an old, battered Bible. This volume was the most valuable thing that Darius had ever possessed. He ran all the way home with it, half suffocated by his triumph. Sunday school prizes had not yet been invented. The young superintendent of the Sunday school was Mr. Shushens. 2. The man Darius was first taken to work by his mother. It was the winter of 1835 January. They passed through the market-place of the town of Turnhill, where they lived. Turnhill lies a couple of miles north of Bursley. One side of the market-place was barricaded with stacks of coal, and the other with loaves of a species of rye and straw bread. This coal and these loaves were being served out by meticulous and haughty officials, all invisibly braided with bread tape, to a crowd of shivering, moaning, and weeping wretches, men, women, and children, the basis of the population of Turnhill. Although they were all endeavouring to make a noise, they made scarcely any noise from mere lack of strength. Nothing could be heard under the implacable bright sky, but faint ghosts of sound, as though people were sighing and crying from within the vacuum of a huge glass bell. The next morning, at 5:30, Darius began his career in earnest. He was mould-runner to a muffin-maker, a muffin being not a comestible but a small plate, fashioned by its maker on a mould. The business of Darius was to run as hard as he could with the mould, and a newly created plate adhering thereto, into the drying stove. This stove was a room lined with shelves, and having a red-hot stove and stovepipe in the middle. As no man of 7 could reach the upper shelves, a pair of steps was provided for Darius, and up these he had to scamper. Each mould with its plate had to be leaned carefully against the wall, and if the soft clay of a newborn plate was damaged, Darius was knocked down. The atmosphere outside the stove was chill, but owing to the heat of the stove, Darius was obliged to work half naked. His sweat ran down his cheeks, and down his chest, and down his back, making white channels, and lastly it soaked his hair. When there were no moulds to be sprinted into the drying stove, and no moulds to be carried less rapidly out, Darius was engaged in clay wedging. That is to say, he took a piece of raw clay weighing more than himself, cut it in two with a wire, raised one half above his head, and crashed it down with all his force upon the other half, and he repeated the process until the clay was thoroughly soft and even in texture. At a later period it was discovered that hydraulic machinery could perform this operation more easily and more effectually than the brawny arms of a man of 7. At 8 o'clock in the evening, Darius was told that he had done enough for that day, and that he must arrive at 5 sharp the next morning to light the fire, before his master the muffin-maker began to work. When he inquired how he was to light the fire, his master kicked him jovially on the thigh, and suggested that he should ask another mould-runner. His master was not a bad man at heart, it was said, but on Tuesdays, after Sunday, and St. Monday, masters were apt to be capricious. Darius reached home at 9:15, having eaten nothing but bread all day. Somehow he had lapsed into the child again. His mother took him on her knee, and wrapped her sacking apron round his ragged clothes, and cried over him, and cried into his supper of porridge, and undressed him and put him to bed. But he could not sleep easily, because he was afraid of being late the next morning. 3. And the next morning, wandering about the yards of the manufactory in a storm of icy sleet a little before 5 o'clock, he learnt from a more experienced companion that nobody would provide him with kindling for his fire, that on the contrary, everybody who happened to be on the place at that hour would unite to prevent him from getting kindling, and that he must steal it or expect to be thrashed before 6 o'clock. Near them, a vast kiln of ware in process of firing showed a white flaming glow at each of its mouths in the black winter darkness. Darius's mentor crept up to the archway of the great hovel which protected the kiln, and pointed like a conspirator to the figure of the guardian fireman dozing near his monster. The boy had the handleless remains of an old spade, and with it he crept into the hovel, dangerously abstracted fire from one of the scorching mouths, and fled therewith, and the fireman never stirred. Then Darius, to whom the mentor kindly lent his spade, attempted to do the same, but being inexpert, woke the fireman, who held him spellbound by his roaring voice, and then flung him like a sack of potatoes bodily into the slush of the yard, and the spade after him. Happily the mentor, whose stove was now alight, lent fire to Darius, so that Darius's stove too was cheerfully burning when his master came, and Darius was too excited to feel fatigue. By 6 o'clock on Saturday night Darius had earned a shilling for his week's work, but he could only possess himself of the shilling by going to a magnificent public house with his master, the muffin-maker. This was the first time that he had ever been inside a public house. The place was crowded with men, women, and children, eating the most lovely hot rolls and drinking beer in an atmosphere exquisitely warm. And behind a high counter a stout jolly man was counting piles and piles and piles of silver. Darius's master, in company with other boys' masters, gave this stout man 4 sovereigns to change, and it was an hour before he changed them. Meanwhile Darius was instructed that he must eat a roll like the rest, together with cheese. Never had he tasted anything so luscious. He had a match with his mentor as to which of them could spin out his roll the longer, honestly chewing all the time, and he won. Someone gave him half a glass of beer. At 7:30 he received his shilling, which consisted of a 6-penny piece and 4 pennies, and, leaving the gay public-house, pushed his way through a crowd of tearful women with babies in their arms at the doors, and went home. And such was the attraction of the Sunday school that he was there the next morning with scented hair 2 minutes before the opening. 4. In about a year, Darius's increasing knowledge of the world enabled him to rise in it. He became a handle-maker in another manufactory, and also he went about with the pride of one who could form the letters of the alphabet with a pen. In his new work he had to put a bit of clay between 2 moulds, and then force the top mould onto the bottom one by means of his stomach, which it was necessary to press downwards and at the same time to wriggle with a peculiar movement. The workman to whom he was assigned, his new master, attached these handles with strange rapid skill to beer mugs. For Darius the labour was much lighter than that of mould running and clay wedging, and the pay was somewhat higher. But there were minor disadvantages. He descended by 20 steps to his toil, and worked in a long cellar which never received any air except by way of the steps and a passage, and never any daylight at all. Its sole illumination was a stove used for drying. The throwers' and the turners' rooms were also subterranean dungeons. When in full activity, all these stinking cellars were full of men, boys, and young women working close together in a hot twilight. Certain boys were trained contrabandists of beer, and beer came as steadily into the dungeons as though it had been laid on by a main pipe. It was not honourable, even on the part of a young woman, to refuse beer, particularly when the beer happened to arrive in the late afternoon. On such occasions young men and women would often entirely omit to go home of a night, and seasoned men of the world, aged 8, on descending into the dungeons early the next morning, would have a full view of pandemonium, and they would witness during the day salutary scenes of remorse, and proofs of the existence of a profound belief in the homeopathic properties of beer. But perhaps the worst drawback of Darius's new position was the long and irregular hours, due partly to the influences of St. Monday and of the scenes above indicated but not described, and partly to the fact that the employees were on piecework and entirely unhampered by grandmotherly legislation. The result was that 6 days' work was generally done in 4, and as the younger the workman the earlier he had to start in the morning, Darius saw scarcely enough of his bed. It was not, of course, to be expected that a self-supporting man of the world should rigorously confine himself to an 8-hour day, or even a 12-hour day, but Darius's day would sometimes stretch to 18 and 19 hours, which, on hygienic grounds, could not be unreservedly defended. 5. One Tuesday evening, his master, after 3 days of debauch, ordered him to be at work at 3 o'clock the next morning. He quickly and even eagerly agreed, for he was already intimate with his master's rope lash. He reached home at 10 o'clock on an autumn night, and went to bed and to sleep. He woke up with a start, in the dark. There was no watch or clock in the house, from which nearly all the furniture had gradually vanished, but he knew it must be already after 3 o'clock, and he sprang up and rushed out. Of course he had not undressed. His life was too strenuous for mere formalities. The stars shone above him as he ran along, wondering whether, after all, though late, he could, by unprecedented effort, make the ordained number of handles before his master tumbled into the cellar at 5 o'clock. When he had run a mile, he met some sewage men on their rounds, who, in reply to his question, told him that the hour was half after midnight. He did not risk a return to home and bed, for within 2.5 hours he must be at work. He wandered aimlessly over the surface of the earth until he came to a tile-works, more or less unenclosed, whose primitive ovens showed a glare. He ventured within, and in spite of himself sat down on the ground near one of those heavenly ovens. And then he wanted to get up again, for he could feel the strong breath of his enemy, sleep. But he could not get up. In a state of terror he yielded himself to his enemy. Shameful cowardice on the part of a man now aged 9. God, however, is merciful, and sent to him an angel in the guise of a night watchman, who kicked him into wakefulness and off the place. He ran on, limping, beneath the stellar systems, and reached his work at 4:30 o'clock. Although he had never felt so exhausted in his long life, he set to work with fury. Useless. When his master arrived, he had scarcely got through the preliminaries. He dully faced his master in the narrow, stifling cellar, lit by candles impaled on nails, and already peopled by the dim figures of boys, girls, and a few men. His master was of taciturn habit, and merely told him to kneel down. He knelt. 2 bigger boys turned hastily from their work to snatch a glimpse of the affair. The master moved to the back of the cellar, and took from a box a piece of rope an inch thick and clogged with clay. At the same moment a companion offered him, in silence, a tin with a slim neck, out of which he drank deep. It contained a pint of porter owing on loan from the previous day. When the master came in due course with the rope to do justice upon the sluggard, he found the lad fallen forward and breathing heavily and regularly. Darius had gone to sleep. He was awakened with some violence, but the public opinion of the dungeon saved him from a torn shirt and a bloody back. This was Darius's last day on a pot bank. The next morning he and his went in procession to the Bastille, as the place was called. His father, having been too prominent and too independent in a strike, had been blacklisted by every manufacturer in the district, and Darius, though 9, could not keep the family. End of Volume 1, Chapter 4. Volume 1, Chapter 5 of Clayhanger by Arnold Bennett This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Volume 1, Chapter 5, Mr. Shushan's Tear Explained. The Bastille was on the top of a hill about a couple of miles long, and the journey thither was much lengthened by the desire of the family to avoid the main road. They were all intensely ashamed. Darius was ashamed to tears, and did not know why. Even his little sister wept and had to be carried, not because she was shoeless and had had nothing to eat, but because she was going to the Bastille. She had no notion what the place was. It proved to be the largest building that Darius had ever seen, and indeed it was the largest in the district. They stood against its steep sides like flies against a kennel. Then there was rattling of key bunches, and the rasping voices of sour officials who did not inquire if they would like a meal after their stroll. And they were put into a cellar, and stripped and washed and dressed in other people's clothes, and then separated amid tears. And Darius was pitched into a large crowd of other boys, all clothed like himself. He now understood the reason for shame. It was because he could have no distinctive clothes of his own, because he had somehow lost his identity. All the boys had a sullen, furtive glance, and when they spoke it was in whispers. In the low room where the boys were assembled there fell a silence, and Darius heard someone whisper that the celebrated boy who had run away and been caught would be flogged before supper. Down the long room ran a long table. Someone brought in 3 candles in tin candlesticks and set them near the end of this table. Then somebody else brought in a pickled birch rod, dripping with the salt water from which it had been taken, and also a small square table. Then came some officials and a clergyman, and then, surpassing the rest in majesty, the governor of the Bastille, a terrible man. The governor made a speech about the crime of running away from the Bastille, and when he had spoken for a fair time, the clergyman talked in the same sense. And then a captured tiger, dressed like a boy, with darting fierce eyes, was dragged in by 2 men, and laid face down on the square table, and 4 boys were commanded to step forward and hold tightly the 4 members of this tiger. And his clothes having previously been removed as far as his waist, his breeches were next pulled down his legs. Then the rod was raised, and it descended swishing, and blood began to flow. But far more startling than the blood were the shrill screams of the tiger. They were so loud and deafening that the spectators could safely converse under their shelter. The boys in charge of the victim had to cling hard and grind their teeth in the effort to keep him prone. As the blows succeeded each other, Darius became more and more ashamed. The physical spectacle did not sicken nor horrify him, for he was a man of wide experience, but he had never before seen flogging by lawful authority. Flogging in the workshop was different, a private if sanguinary affair between free human beings. This ritualistic and cold-blooded torture was infinitely more appalling in its humiliation. The screaming grew feebler, then ceased. Then the blows ceased, and the unconscious infant, cured of being a tiger, was carried away, leaving a trail of red drops along the floor. 2. After this, supper was prepared on the long table, and the clergyman called down upon it the blessing of God, and enjoined the boys to be thankful, and departed in company with the governor. Darius, who had not tasted all day, could not eat. The flogging had not nauseated him, but the bread and the skilly revolted his pampered tastes. Never had he, with all his experience, seen nor smelt anything so foully disgusting. When supper was completed, a minor official interceded with the Almighty in various ways for 10 minutes, and at last the boys were marched upstairs to bed. They all slept in one room. The night also could be set down in words, but must not be, lest the setting down should be disastrous. Darius knew that he was ruined. He knew that he was a workhouse boy for evermore, and that the bright freedom of 16 hours a day in a cellar was lost to him for evermore. He was now a prisoner, branded, hopeless. He would never be able to withstand the influences that had closed around him and upon him. He supposed that he should become desperate, become a tiger, And then 3. But the following afternoon he was forcibly reclothed in his own beautiful and beloved rags, and was pushed out of the Bastille, and there he saw his pale father and his mother and his little sister, and another man. And his mother was on her knees in the cold autumn sunshine, and hysterically clasping the knees of the man, and weeping, and the man was trying to raise her, and the man was weeping too. Darius wept. The man was Mr. Shushens. Somehow, in a way that Darius comprehended not, Mr. Shushens had saved them. Mr. Shushens, in a beaver tall hat, and with an apron rolled round his waist under his coat, escorted them back to their house, into which some fresh furniture had been brought. And Darius knew that a situation was waiting for his father, and further, Mr. Shushens, by his immense mysterious power, found a superb situation for Darius himself as a printer's devil. All this because Mr. Shushens, as superintendent of a Sunday school, was emotionally interested in the queer, harsh boy who had there picked up the art of writing so quickly. Such was the origin of the tear that ran down Mr. Shushens' cheek when he beheld Edwin, well-nourished, well-dressed, and intelligent, the son of Darius, the successful steam-printer. Mr. Shushens' tear was the tear of the Creator, looking down upon his creation and marvelling at it. Mr. Shushens loved Darius as only the benefactor can love the benefited. He had been out of the district for over 30 years, and, having returned there to die, the wonder of what he had accomplished by merely saving a lad from the certain perdition of a prolonged stay in the workhouse struck him blindingly in the face and dazzled him. Darius had never spoken to a soul of his night in the Bastille. All his infancy was his own fearful secret. His life, seen whole, had been a miracle, but none knew that except himself and Mr. Shushens. Assuredly Edwin never even faintly suspected it. To Edwin, Mr. Shushens was nothing but a feeble and tedious old man. End of Volume 1, Chapter 5. Volume 1, Chapter 6 of Clayhanger by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Volume 1, Chapter 6, In the House. To return to Edwin. On that Friday afternoon of the breaking up, he was, in the local phrase, at a loose end. That is, he had no task, no programme, and no definite desires. Not knowing when he started out in the morning whether school would formally end before or after the dinner hour, he had taken his dinner with him as usual, and had eaten it at Oldcastle. Thus, though the family dinner had not begun when he reached home, he had no share in it, partly because he was not hungry, and partly because he was shy about having left school. The fact that he had left school affected him as he was affected by the wearing of a new suit for the first time, or by the cutting of his hair after prolonged neglect of the barber. It inspired him with a wish to avoid his kind, and especially his sisters, Maggie and Clara. Clara might make some facetious remark. Edwin could never forget the Red Indian glee with which Clara had danced round him when for the first time, and quite unprepared for the exquisite shock, she had seen him in long trousers. There was also his father. He wanted to have a plain talk with his father. He knew that he would not be at peace until he had had that talk. And yet, in spite of himself, he had carefully kept out of his father's way during all the afternoon, save for a moment when, strolling with affected nonchalance up to Darius's private desk in the shop, he dropped thereon his school report, and strolled off again. Towards 6 o'clock he was in his bedroom, an attic with a floor very much more spacious than its ceiling, and a window that commanded the slope of Trafalgar Road towards Bleakridge. It had been his room, his castle, his sanctuary, for at least 10 years, since before his mother's death of cancer. He did not know that he loved it with all its inconveniences and makeshifts, but he did love it, and he was jealous for it. No one should lay a hand on it to rearrange what he had once arranged. His sisters knew this, the middle-aged servants knew it, even his father, with a curt laugh, would humorously acquiesce in the theory of the sacredness of Edwin's bedroom. As for Edwin, he saw nothing extraordinary in his attitude concerning his bedroom, and he could not understand, and he somewhat resented, that the household should perceive anything comic in it. He never went near his sister's bedroom, never wished to go near it, never thought about it. 2. Now he sat idly on the patchwork counterpane of his bed and gazed at the sky. He was feeling a little happier, a little less unsettled, for his stomach was empty, and his mind had begun to fix itself with pleasure on the images of hot toast and jam. He wanted his tea. The manner in which he glanced at his old silver watch proved that. He wished only that before 6 o'clock struck he could settle upon the necessary changes in his bedroom. A beautiful schooner, which for over a year, with all sails spread, had waited the breeze in a low dark corner to the right of the window, would assuredly have to be dismissed to the small empty attic. Once that schooner had thrilled him. The slight rake of its masts and the knotted reality of its rigging had thrilled him, and to navigate it had promised the most delicious sensations conceivable. Now, one moment it was a toy as silly as a doll, and the next moment it thrilled him once more, and he could believe again its promises of bliss. And then he knew that it was forever a vain toy, and he was sad, and his sadness was pleasure. He had already stacked most of his schoolbooks in the other attic. He would need a table and a lamp. He knew not for what precise purpose, but a table and a lamp were necessary to the continuance of his self-respect. The only question was, should he remodel his bedroom, or should he demand the other attic and plant his flag in it and rule over it in addition to his bedroom? Had he the initiative and the energy to carry out such an enterprise? He was not able to make up his mind. And moreover, he could not decide anything until after that plain talk with his father. His sister Clara's high voice sounded outside on the landing, or halfway up the attic stairs. "Edwin! Edwin!" "What's up?" he called in answer, rising with a nervous start. The door of the room was unlatched. "You're mighty mysterious in your bedroom," said Clara's voice behind the door. Come in. Why don't you come in?" he replied with good-natured impatience. But somehow he could not speak in a natural tone. The mere fact that he had left school that day, and that the world awaited him, and that everybody in the house knew this, rendered him self-conscious. 3. Clara entered with a curious sidelong movement, half winning and half serpentine. She was aged 14, a very fair and very slight girl, with a thin face and thin lips and extraordinarily slender hands. In general appearance fragile. She wore a semicircular comb on the crown of her head, and her abundant hair hung over her shoulders in 2 tight pigtails. Edwin considered that Clara was harsh and capricious. He had much fault to find with her, but nevertheless the sight of her usually affected him pleasurably, of course without his knowing it, and he never for long sat definitely in adverse judgment upon her. Her gestures had a charm for him which he felt but did not realize, and this charm was similar to his own charm. But nothing would have so surprised him as to learn that he himself had any charm at all. He would have laughed and been ashamed to hear that his gestures and the play of his features had an ingratiating, awkward, and wistful grace. He would have tried to cure that. "Father wants you," said Clara, her hand on the handle of the thin attic door hung with odd garments. Edwin's heart fell instantly, and all the agreeable images of tea vanished from his mind. His father must have read the school report, and perceived that Edwin had been beaten by Charlie Orgreave, a boy younger than himself. "Did he send you up for me?" Edwin asked. "No," said Clara, frowning, "but I heard him calling out for you all over, so Maggie told me to run up. Not that I expect any thanks." She put her head forward a little. The episode and Clara's tone showed clearly the nature and force of the paternal authority in the house. It was an authority with the gift of getting its commands anticipated. "All right, I'm coming," said Edwin superiorly. "I know what you want," Clara said teasingly as she turned towards the passage. "What do I want?" "You want the empty attic all to yourself, and a fine state it would be in a month, my word." "How do you know I want the empty attic?" Edwin repelled the onslaught, but he was considerably taken aback. It was a mystery to him how these girls, and Clara in particular, got wind of his ideas before he had even formulated them definitely to himself. It was also a mystery to him how they could be so tremendously interested in matters which did not concern them. "You never mind," Clara jibed with a smile that was malicious, but charmingly malicious. "I know." She had merely seen him staring into the empty attic, and from that brief spectacle she had by divination constructed all his plans. 4. The Clayhanger sitting-room, which served as both dining-room and drawing-room, according to the more primitive practices of those days, was over one half of the shop, and looked on Duck Square. Owing to its northern aspect, it scarcely ever saw the sun. The furniture followed the universal fashion of horsehair, mahogany, and wool embroidery. There was a piano, with a high, back-fretted wood over silk pleated in rays from the centre, a bookcase, whose lower part was a cupboard, a sofa, and a large leather easy-chair which did not match the rest of the room. This easy-chair had its back to the window, and its front legs a little towards the fireplace, so that Mr. Clayhanger could read his newspaper with facility in daytime. At night the light fell a little awkwardly from the central chandelier, and Mr. Clayhanger, if he happened to be reading, would continually shift his chair an inch or two to left or right, backwards or forwards, and would also continually glance up at the chandelier, as if accusing it of not doing its best. A common sight in the sitting-room was Mr. Clayhanger balanced on a chair, the table having been pushed away, screwing the newest burner into the chandelier. When he was seated in his easy-chair, the piano could not be played because there was not sufficient space for the stool between the piano and his chair. Nor could the fire be made up without disturbing him, because the japanned coal-box was on the same side of the hearth-rug as the chair. Thus, when the fire languished and Mr. Clayhanger neglected it, the children had either to ask permission to step over his legs, or suggest that he should attend to the fire himself. Occasionally, when he was in one of his gay moods, he would humorously impede the efforts of the fire-maker with his feet, and if the fire-maker was Clara or Edwin, the child would tickle him, which brought him to his senses, and forced him to shout, "None of that, none of that!" The position of Mr. Clayhanger's easy-chair, a detail apparently trifling, was in reality a strongly influencing factor in the family life, for it meant that the father's presence obsessed the room. And it could not be altered, for it depended on the window. The window was too small to be quite efficient. When the children reflected upon the history of their childhood, they saw one important aspect of it as a long series of detached hours spent in the sitting-room, in a state of desire to do something that could not be done without disturbing father, and in a state of indecision whether or not to disturb him. If by chance, as sometimes occurred, he chose to sit on the sofa, which was unobtrusive in the corner away from the window, between the fireplace and the door, the room was instantly changed to something larger, freer, and less inconvenient. 5. As the hour was approaching 6, Edwin, on the way downstairs, looked in at the sitting-room for his father. But Darius was not there. "Where's father?" he demanded. "I don't know, I'm sure," said Maggie, at the sewing-machine. Maggie was aged 20, dark, rather stout, with an expression at once benevolent and worried. She rarely seemed to belong to the same generation as her brother and sister. She consorted on equal terms with married women, and talked seriously of the same things as they did. Mr. Clayhanger treated her somewhat differently from the other two. Yet, though he would often bid them accept her authority, he would now and then impair that authority by roughly dressing her down at the meal-table. She was a capable girl. She had much less firmness and much more good nature than she seemed to have. She could not assert herself adequately. She managed very well. Indeed, she had done wonders in filling the place of the mother who had died when Clara was 4 and Edwin 6, and she herself only 10. Responsibility, apprehension, and strained effort had printed their marks on her features. But the majority of acquaintances were more impressed by her good intention than by her capacity. They would call her a nice thing. The discerning minority, while saying with admiring conviction that she was a very fine girl, would regret that somehow she had not the faculty of making the best of herself, of putting her best foot foremost. And would they not heartily stand up for her with the superficial majority? A thin, grey-haired, dreamy-eyed woman hurried into the room, bearing a noisy tray, and followed by Clara with a white cloth. This was Mrs. Nixon, the domestic staff of the Clayhanger household for years. Clara and Mrs. Nixon swept Maggie's sewing materials from the corner of the table onto a chair, put Maggie's flower glasses onto the ledge of the bookcase, folded up the green cloth, and began rapidly to lay the tea. Simultaneously, Maggie, glancing at the clock, closed up her sewing machine and deposited her work in a basket. Clara, leaving the table, stooped to pick up the bits of cotton and white stuff that littered the carpet. The clock struck 6. "Now, Sharpie," she exclaimed curtly to Edwin, who stood hesitating with his hands in his pockets, "can't you help Maggie to push that sewing machine into the corner?" "What on earth's up?" he inquired vaguely, but starting forward to help Maggie. "She'll be here in a minute," said Maggie, almost under her breath, as she fitted on the cover of the sewing machine. "Who?" asked Edwin. "Oh, Auntie, I'd forgotten it was her night." "As if anybody could forget," murmured Clara with sarcastic unbelief. By this time the table was completely set. 6. Edwin wondered mildly, as he often wondered, at the extremely bitter tone in which Clara always referred to their aunt Clara Hamps, when Mrs. Hamps was not there. Even Maggie's private attitude to Auntie Clara was scarcely more Christian. Mrs. Hamps was the widowed younger sister of their mother, and she had taken a certain share in the supervision of Darius Clayhanger's domestic affairs after the death of Mrs. Clayhanger. This latter fact might account, partially but not wholly, for the intense and steady dislike in which she was held by Maggie, Clara, and Mrs. Nixon. Clara hated her own name because she had been called after her auntie. Mr. Clayhanger got on excellently with his sister-in-law. He thought highly of her, and was indeed proud to have her for a relative. In their father's presence the girls never showed their dislike of Mrs. Hamps. It was a secret pleasure shared between them and Mrs. Nixon, and only disclosed to Edwin because the girls were indifferent to what Edwin might think. They casually despised him for somehow liking his auntie, for not seeing through her wiles, but they could count on his loyalty to themselves. "Are you ready for tea, or aren't you?" Clara asked him. She frequently spoke to him as if she was the elder instead of the younger. "Yes," he said, "but I must find father." He went off, but he did not find his father in the shop, and after a few futile minutes he returned upstairs. Mrs. Nixon preceded him, carrying the tea-urn, and she told him that his father had sent word into the kitchen that they were not to wait tea for him. End of Volume 1, Chapter 6. Volume 1, Chapter 7 of Clayhanger by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Volume 1, Chapter 7, Auntie Hamps. Mrs. Hamps had splendidly arrived. The atmosphere of the sitting-room was changed. Maggie, smiling, wore her second-best black silk apron. Clara, smiling and laughing, wore a clean, long white pinafore. Mrs. Nixon, with her dreamy eyes less vacant than usual, greeted Mrs. Hamps effusively, and effusively gave humble thanks for kind inquiries after her health. A stranger might have thought that these women were strongly attached to one another by ties of affection and respect. Edwin never understood how his sisters, especially Maggie, could practise such vast and eternal hypocrisy with his aunt. As for him, his aunt acted on him now, as generally, like a tonic. Some effluence from her quickened him. He put away the worry in connection with his father, and gave himself up to the physical pleasures of tea. Aunt Clara was a handsome woman. She had been called, but not by men whose manners and code she would have approved, a damned fine woman. Her age was about 40, which at that period, in a woman's habit of mind, was the equivalent of about 50 today. Her latest photograph was considered to be very successful. It showed her standing behind a velvet chair and leaning her large but still shapely bust slightly over the chair. Her forearms, ruffled and braceleted, lay along the fringed back of the chair, and from one negligent hand depended a rose. A heavy curtain came downward out of nothing into the picture, and the end of it lay coiled and draped on the seat of the chair. The great dress was of slate-coloured silk, with sleeves tight to the elbow, and thence, from a ribbon bow, broadening to a wide triangular climax that revealed quantities of lace at the wrists. The pointed ends of the sleeves were picked out with squares of velvet. A short and highly ornamental fringed and looped flounce waved grandly out behind from the waist to the level of the knees, and the stomacher recalled the ornamentation of the flounce, and both the stomacher and flounce gave contrasting value to the severe plainness of the skirt, designed to emphasize the quality of the silk. Round the neck was a lace collarette to match the furniture of the wrists, and the broad ends of the collarette were crossed on the bosom and held by a large jet brooch. Above that you saw a fine, regular face, with a firm, hard mouth, and a very straight nose and dark eyebrows, small ears weighted with heavy jet earrings. The photograph could not render the clear perfection of Aunt Clara's rosy skin. She had the colour and the flashing eye of a girl, but it did justice to her really magnificent black hair. This hair was all her own, and the coiffure seemed as ample as a judge's wig. From the low forehead the hair was parted exactly in the middle for about 2 inches. Then plaited bands crossed and recrossed the scalp in profusion, forming behind a pattern exceedingly complicated, and down either side of the head, now behind the ear, now hiding it, now resting on the shoulders, now hanging clear of them, fell long, multitudinous, glossy curls. These curls, one of them in the photograph reaching as far as the stomacher, could not have been surpassed in Bursley. She was a woman of terrific vitality. Her dead sister had been nothing in comparison with her. She had a glorious digestion, and was the envy of her brother-in-law, who suffered much from biliousness, because she could eat with perfect impunity hot buttered toast and raw celery in large quantities. Further, she had independent means and no children to cause anxieties. Yet she was always, as the phrase went, bearing up, or, as another phrase went, leaning hard. Frances Ridley Havergal was her favourite author, and Frances Ridley Havergal's little book Lean Hard was kept on her dressing-table. The girls, however, averred that she never opened it. Aunt Clara's spiritual life must be imagined as a continual, almost physical leaning on Christ. Nevertheless, she never complained, and she was seldom depressed. Her desire and her achievement was to be bright, to take everything cheerfully, to look obstinately on the best side of things, and to instil this religion into others. 2. Thus, when it was announced that father had been called out unexpectedly, leaving an order that they were not to wait for him, she said gaily that they had better be obedient and begin, though it would have been more agreeable to wait for father. And she said how beautiful the tea was, and how beautiful the toast, and how beautiful the strawberry jam, and how beautiful the pikelets. She would herself pour some hot water into the slop basin, and put a pikelet on a plate thereon, covered, to keep warm for father. She would not hear a word about the toast being a little hard, and when Maggie, in her curious, quiet way, stuck her out that the toast was in fact hard, she said that that precise degree of hardness was the degree which she, for herself, preferred. Then she talked of jams, and mentioned gooseberry jam, whereupon Clara privately put her tongue out with the quickness of a snake to signal to Maggie. "Ours isn't good this year," said Maggie. "I told Auntie we weren't so set up with it a fortnight ago," said Clara simply, like a little angel. "Did you, dear?" Mrs. Hamp exclaimed, with great surprise, almost with shocked surprise. "I'm sure it's beautiful. I was quite looking forward to tasting it, quite. I know what your gooseberry jam is." "Would you like to try it now?" Maggie suggested. "But we've warned you." "Oh, I don't want to trouble you now. We're all so cosy here. Any time—" "No trouble, Auntie," said Clara, with her most captivating and innocent smile. "Well, if you talk about warning me, of course I must insist on having some," said Auntie Clara. Clara jumped up, passed behind Mrs. Hamps, making a contemptuous face at those curls as she did so, and ran gracefully down to the kitchen. "Here," she said crossly to Mrs. Nixon, "a pot of that gooseberry, please. A small one will do. She knows it's short of sugar, and so she's determined to try it just out of spite, and nothing will stop her." Clara returned smiling to the tea-table, and Maggie neatly unsealed the jam, and Auntie Clara, with a face beaming with pleasurable anticipation, helped herself circumspectly to a spoonful. "Beautiful," she murmured. "Don't you think it's a bit tart?" Maggie asked. "Oh, no," protestingly.
"Don't you?"
asked Clara, with an air of delighted deferential astonishment.
"Oh, no,"
Mrs. Hamps repeated. "It's beautiful." She did not smack her lips over it, because she would have considered it unladylike to smack her lips, but by less offensive gestures she sought to convey her unbounded pleasure in the jam. "How much sugar did you put in?" she inquired after a while.
"Half and half."
"Yes," said Maggie.
"They do say gooseberries were a tiny bit sour this year, owing to the weather," said Mrs. Hamps reflectively.
Clara kicked Edwin under the table, as it were viciously, but her delightful innocent smile, directed vaguely upon Mrs. Hamps, did not relax. Such duplicity passed Edwin's comprehension. It seemed to him purposeless. Yet he could not quite deny that there might be a certain sting, a certain insinuation, in his auntie's last remark. 3. Then Mr. Clayhanger entered, blowing forth a long breath, as if he was trying to repulse the oppressive heat of the July afternoon. He came straight to the table with a slightly preoccupied air, quickly, his arms motionless at his sides, and slanting a little outwards. Mr. Clayhanger always walked like this, with motionless arms, so that in spite of a rather clumsy and heavy step, the upper part of him appeared to glide along. He shook hands genially with Auntie Clara, greeted her almost as grandiosely as she greeted him, putting on for a moment the grand manner, not without dignity. Each admired the other. Each often said that the other was wonderful. Each undoubtedly flattered the other, made a fuss of the other. Mr. Clayhanger's admiration was the greater. The bitterest thing that Edwin had ever heard Maggie say was, "It's something to be thankful for that she's his deceased wife's sister." And she had said the bitter thing with such quiet bitterness. Edwin had not instantly perceived the point of it. Darius Clayhanger then sat down, with a thud, snatched at the cup of tea which Maggie had placed before him, and drank half of it with a considerable indrawing noise. No one asked where or why he had been detained. It was not etiquette to do so. If father had been called away, or had to go away, or was kept somewhere, the details were out of deference allowed to remain in mystery, respected by curiosity. Father business. All business was sacred. He himself had inculcated this attitude. In a short silence, the sound of the bell that the carman rang before the tram started for Hanbridge floated in through the open window. "There's the tram," observed Auntie Clara, apparently with warm and special interest in the phenomena of the tram. Then another little silence.
"Auntie,"
said Clara, writhing about youthfully on her chair.
"Can't you sit still a bit?"
the father asked, interrupting her roughly but with good humour.
"You'll be falling off the chair in a minute."
Clara blushed swiftly and stopped. "Yes, love," Auntie Clara encouraged her. It was as if Auntie Clara had said, "Your dear father is of course quite right, more than right, to insist on your sitting properly at table. However, do not take the correction too much to heart. I sympathize with all your difficulties."
I was only going to ask you," Clara went on in a weaker, stammering voice, "if you knew that Edwin's left school today."
Her archness had deserted her. "Mischievous little thing," thought Edwin. "Why must she deliberately go and draw attention to that?" And he too blushed, feeling as if he owed an apology to the company for having left school. "Oh, yes," said Auntie Clara with eager benevolence. "I've got something to say about that to me nephew." Mr. Clayhanger searched in a pocket of his alpaca and drew forth an open envelope.
"Here's the lad's report, Auntie," said he. "Happen you'd like to look at it."
"I should indeed," she replied fervently. "I'm sure it's a very good one."
4. She took the paper and assumed her spectacles. "Conduct excellent," she read, poring with enthusiasm over the document, and she read again, "Conduct excellent." Then she went down the list of subjects, declaiming the number of marks for each, and at the end she read, "Position in class next term, 3rd. "Splendid, Eddie!" she exclaimed.
"I thought you were 2nd,"
said Clara in her sharp manner. Edwin blushed again and hesitated.
"Eh? What's that? What's that?" his father demanded. "I didn't notice that. 3rd?" Charlie Orgreave beat me in the examination, Edwin muttered. Well, that's a pretty howdy-do, said his father. Going down one. You ought to have been first instead of third. It would have been happen if you pegged at it.
No, I won't have that. I won't have it, Auntie Clara protested, laughingly showing her fine teeth and gazing first at Darius and then at Edwin from under her spectacles, her head being thrown back and the curls hanging far behind. No one shall say that Edwin doesn't work, not even his father, while his aunt is about, because I know he does work. And besides, he hasn't gone down. It says position next term, not this term. You were still second today, weren't you, me boy? I suppose so, yes, Edwin answered, pulling himself together. Well, there you are. Auntie Clara's voice rang triumphantly. She was opening her purse. And there you are, she repeated, popping half a sovereign down in front of him. That's a little present for your auntie on your leaving school. Oh, auntie, he cried feebly. Oh, cried Clara, genuinely startled. Mrs. Hamps was sometimes thus astoundingly munificent. It was she who had given the schooner to Edwin, and her presents of elaborately enveloped and costly toilet soap on the birthdays of the children and at Christmas were massive. Yet Clara always maintained that she was the meanest old thing imaginable, and Maggie had once said that she knew that Auntie Clara made her servant eat dripping instead of butter. To give inferior food to a servant was to Maggie the unforgivable in parsimony.
Well, Mr. Clayhanger warningly inquired, what do you say to your aunt?
Thank you, auntie, Edwin sheepishly responded, fingering the coin. It was a princely sum, and she'd stuck up for him famously in the matter of the report. Strange that his father should not have read the report with sufficient attention to remark the fall to third place. Anyway, that aspect of the affair was now safely over, and it seemed to him that he had not lost much prestige by it. He would still be able to argue with his father on terms not too unequal, he hoped. 5. As the tea drew to an end, and the plates of toast, bread and butter, and tea-cake grew emptier, and the slop basin filled, and only Maggie's flowers remained fresh and immaculate amid the untidy debris of the meal, and as Edwin and Clara became gradually indifferent to jam, and then inimical to it, and as the sounds of the street took on the softer quality of summer evening, and the first filmish shades of twilight gathered imperceptibly in the corners of the room, and Mr. Clayhanger performed the eructations which signified that he had had enough. So Mrs. Hamps prepared herself for one of her classic outbursts of feeling. "Well," she said at last, putting her spoon to the left of her cup as a final indication that seriously she would drink no more. And she gave a great sigh. "School over, and the only son going out into the world. How time flies!" And she gave another great sigh, implying an immense melancholy due to this vision of the reality of things. Then she remembered her courage and the device of leaning hard, and all her philosophy. "But it's all for the best," she broke forth in a new, brave tone. "Everything is ordered for the best. We must never forget that. And I'm quite sure that Edwin will be a very great credit to us all, with help from above." She proceeded powerfully in this strain. She brought in God, Christ, and even the Holy Spirit. She mentioned the dangers of the world, and the disguises of the devil, and the unspeakable advantages of a good home, and the special goodness of Mr. Clayhanger and of Maggie, yes, and of her little Clara, and the pride which they all had in Edwin, and the unique opportunities which he had of doing good by example, and also, soon, by precept, for others younger than himself would begin to look up to him. And again her personal pride in him, and her sure faith in him, and what a solemn hour it was. Nothing could stop her. The girls loathed these exhibitions. Maggie always looked at the table during their progress, and she felt as though she had done something wrong and was ashamed of it. Clara not merely felt like a criminal, she felt like an unrepentant criminal. She blushed, she glanced nervously about the room, and all the time she repeated steadily in her heart a highly obscene word which she had heard at school. This unspoken word, hurled soundlessly but savagely at her aunt in that innocent heart, afforded much comfort to Clara in the affliction. Even Edwin, who was more lenient in all ways than his sisters, profoundly deplored these moralizings of his aunt, They filled him with the desire to run fast and far, to be alone at sea, or to be deep somewhere in the bosom of the earth. He could not understand this side of his auntie's individuality. But there was no delivery from Mrs. Hamps. The only person who could possibly have delivered them seemed to enjoy the sinister thraldom. Mr. Clayhanger listened with appreciative and admiring nods. He appeared to be quite sincere. And Edwin could not understand his father either. How simple father must be, he thought vaguely, whereas Clara fatalistically dismissed her father's attitude as only one more of the preposterously unreasonable phenomena which she was constantly meeting in life, and she persevered grimly with her obscene word. 6. "Eh?" said Mrs. Hamps enthusiastically, after a trifling pause. "It does me good when I think what a help you'll be to your father in the business, with that clever head of yours." She gazed at him fondly. Now this was Edwin's chance. He did not wish to be any help at all to his father in the business. He had other plans for himself. He had never mentioned them before, because his father had never talked to him about his future career, apparently assuming that he would go into the business. He had been waiting for his father to begin. "Surely," he had said to himself, "father's bound to speak to me some time about what I'm going to do, and when he does I shall just tell him." But his father never had begun, and by timidity, negligence, and perhaps ill luck, Edwin had thus arrived at his last day at school with the supreme question not merely unsolved, but unattacked. Oh, he blamed himself. Any ordinary boy, he thought, would have discussed such a question naturally long ago. After all, it was not a crime, it was no cause for shame to wish not to be a printer. Yet he was ashamed. Absurd. He blamed himself, but he also blamed his father. Now, however, in responding to his aunt's remark, he could remedy all the past by simply and boldly stating that he did not want to follow his father. It would be unpleasant, of course, but the worst shock would be over in a moment, like the drawing of a tooth. He had merely to utter certain words. He must utter them. They were perfectly easy to say, and they were also of the greatest urgency. "I don't want to be a printer." He mumbled them over in his mind. "I don't want to be a printer." What could it matter to his father whether he was a printer or not? Seconds, minutes seemed to pass. He knew that if he was so inconceivably craven as to remain silent, his self-respect would never recover from the blow. Then, in response to Mrs. Hamp's prediction about his usefulness to his father in the business, he said, with a false, jaunty, unconvincing air, "Well, that remains to be seen." That was all he could accomplish. It seemed as if he had looked death itself in the face and drawn away. "Remains to be seen?" Auntie Clara repeated, with a hint of startled pain due to this levity. He was mute. No one suspected, as he sat there, so boyish, wistful, and uneasily squirming, that he was agonized to the very centre of his being. All the time, in his sweating soul, he kept trying to persuade himself, "I've given them a hint, anyhow. I've given them a hint, anyhow." Them included everybody at the table. 7. Mr. Clayhanger, completely ignoring Edwin's reply to his aunt and her somewhat shocked repetition of it, turned suddenly towards his son and said, in a manner friendly but serious, a manner that assumed everything, a manner that begged the question, unconscious even that there was a question, "I shall be out the better part tomorrow. I want you to be sure to be in the shop all afternoon. I'll tell you what for downstairs." It was characteristic of him thus to make a mystery of business in front of the women. Edwin felt the net closing about him. Then he thought of one of those posers which often present themselves to youths of his age. "But tomorrow's Saturday," he said, perhaps perkily. "What about the Bible class?" 6 months previously, a young minister of the Wesleyan circuit, to whom heaven had denied both a sense of humour and a sense of honour, had committed the infamy of starting a Bible class for big boys on Saturday afternoons. This outrage had appalled and disgusted the boyhood of Wesleyanism in Bursley. Their afternoon for games, their only fair afternoon in the desert of the week, to be filched from them and used against them for such an odious purpose as a Bible class. Not only Sunday school on Sunday afternoon, but a Bible class on Saturday afternoon. It was incredible. It was unbearable. It was gross tyranny and nothing else. Nevertheless, the young minister had his way, by dint of meanly calling upon parents and invoking their help. The scurvy worm actually got together a class of 12 to 15 boys, to the end of securing their eternal welfare. And they had to attend the class, though they swore they never would, and they had to sing hymns, and they had to kneel and listen to prayers, and they had to listen to the most intolerable tedium, and to take notes of it. All this while the sun was shining or the rain was raining on fields and streets and open spaces and ponds. Edwin had been trapped in the snare. His father, after only 3 words from the young minister, had yielded up his son like a burnt sacrifice, and with a casual nonchalance that utterly confounded Edwin. In vain Edwin had pointed out to his elders that a Saturday afternoon of confinement must be bad for his health. His attention had been directed to his eternal health. In vain he pointed out that on wet Saturday afternoons he frequently worked at his home lessons, which therefore might suffer under the regime of a Bible class. His attention had been directed to the peace which passeth understanding. So he had been beaten, and was secretly twitted by Clara as an abject victim. Hence it was with a keen and peculiar feeling of triumph, of hopelessly cornering the inscrutable generation which a few months ago had cornered him, that he demanded, perhaps perkily, "What about the Bible class?" "There'll be no more Bible classing," said his father, with a mild but slightly sardonic smile, as who should say, "I'm ready to make all allowances for youth, but I must get you to understand, as gently as I can, that you can't keep on going to Bible classes for ever and ever." Mrs. Hamp said, "It won't be as if you were at school, but I do hope you won't neglect to study your Bible. But I do hope you'll always find time for that, to your dying day." "Oh, but I say," Edwin began, and stopped. He was beaten by the mere effrontery of the replies. His father and his aunt, the latter of whom at any rate was a firm and confessed religionist, who had been responsible for converting Mr. Clayhanger from primitive Methodism to Wesleyan Methodism, did not trouble to defend their new position by argument. They made no effort to reconcile it with their position of a few months back, when the importance of heavenly welfare far exceeded the importance of any conceivable earthly welfare. The fact was that they had no argument. If God took precedence of knowledge and of health, he took precedence of a peddling shop. That was unanswerable. 8. Edwin was dashed. His faith in humanity was dashed. These elders were not sincere. And as Mrs. Hamps continued to embroider the original theme of her exhortation about the Bible, Edwin looked at her stealthily, and the doubt crossed his mind whether that majestic and vital woman was ever sincere about anything, even to herself, whether the whole of her daily existence from her getting up to her down-lying was not a grandiose pretence. Not that he had the least desire to cling to the Bible class, even as an alternative to the shop. No. He was much relieved to be rid of the Bible class. What overset him was the crude illogicality of the new decree, and the shameless tacit admission of previous insincerity. 2 hours later, as he stood idly at the window of his bedroom, watching the gas lamps of Trafalgar Road wax brighter in the last glooms of twilight, he was still occupied with the sham and the unreason and the lack of scruple suddenly revealed in the life of the elder generation. Unconsciously imitating a trick of his father's when annoyed but calm, he nodded his head several times, and with his tongue against his teeth made the noise which in writing is represented by tsk, tsk. Yet somehow he had always known that it would be so. At bottom he was only pretending to himself to be shocked and outraged. His plans were no further advanced. Indeed, they were put back, for this Saturday afternoon vigil in the shop would be in some sort a symbolic temporary defeat for him. Why had he not spoken out clearly? Why were he always like a baby in presence of his father? The future was all askew for him. He had forgotten his tremendous, serious resolves. The touch of the half-sovereign in his pocket, however, was comforting in a universe of discomfort. End of Volume 1, Chapter 7.